Good afternoon, Dumelang, Sanbonani to all participants here with us today, wherever you are dialing in from. I was actually scrolling through the list of participants before we began, and it's very pleasing and encouraging to see familiar names and faces as well here with us today to continue the work that actually began last year when the new journal, the International Review of Philanthropy and Social Investment Journal, was launched sometime in August 2020. This journal is an essential development for African researchers to be able to publish their work in the field of African philanthropy and social investment, and to provide data and facts that are pertaining to African philanthropy, something that we have been crying and wishing for a very long time. The inaugural issue of the journal had various papers in it, published from different corners of our continent, and they covered various elements of philanthropy. Some papers looked at corporate social investments, some looked at rural context, some looked at community philanthropy. So it was a very rich issue. We decided that because it was the first issue, that we need to have one-on-ones with the authors that were part of that publication process and just dive into each of their papers and give them an opportunity to tell us more. We've already had 4 webinars in the past. They began last year, straight after the journal was launched. We've already had 4 of them, so this would be the 5th one. And we just bring 2 authors maximum in each session to spend some time with us. Take us through their work. What did they find? What contribution does that finding make to the sector? And what process did they go through as a researcher? Overall, what was their experience? The previous webinars that we've had last year all managed to fulfill this agenda. So today we are continuing. In Portuguese, they say, a luta continua. We are continuing this fight and turning our attention to 2 more speakers who are part of the journey. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers to you today. First, we have Gima H.Forje from the TY Danjuma Foundation, and he'll be taking us through his paper. His paper is titled Giving with a Purpose, 10 Years of Touching Lives by the TY Danjuma Foundation, who most of you will be familiar with. Secondly, I'd like to introduce Tendai Murisa, who is no stranger to CAPSI. He's an associate researcher with us, and he also runs the Civio Research Institute in Harare. His paper is titled Exploring the Means of Philanthropy in Rural Context, the Case of Zimbabwe. So both of them are going to spend some time with us. They've prepared very well for this session. So we will allow them some space to present their work to you. We strongly encourage you to take part in the session. The speakers have prepared, but it's by no means a monologue. I'm sure you've read the paper already. So this is your opportunity to engage with each of the authors. You are free to post your questions and your comments on the chat function. The Q&A function will also be up and running for you shortly. And you can do this throughout the webinar. So you don't need to wait for the Q&A session. If Gima says something that interests you, you can ask immediately the moment that he's done. If you are feeling brave, and if time allows, you can also raise your hand. There's a raise hand option at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be sure to attend to you depending on where we are with the time. The session is being live streamed on Facebook. It will also be available on the CAPSI YouTube channel, so you can watch it again and again if you missed anything during the live proceedings today. Please keep your microphones off throughout the proceedings, unless, of course, you have been acknowledged to speak. Okay, so without any further ado, let's dive right in. I'd like to call upon our first speaker. The first speaker is Gima H.Forje from the TY Danjuma Foundation. He will present his paper, for the number of years that TY Danjuma Foundation has been touching lives. So Gima, karibu sana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Keratilio. Thank you so much to all the participants that are online, and really for the opportunity to share with you some of the work we do at the TY Danjuma Foundation. And the way it is synthesized in the paper, and for me, the focus really is that reflecting back on the 10 years of our work, it will seem that no matter what we do, and really no matter what government does, if we do not have a deliberate and increased investment towards bridging these gaps in social inequalities and making sure that development is more inclusive, we really will not be making a lot of headway, because then you can have a whole lot of development that goes towards improving the life of those that really do not need a lot of help. So what we are looking at is how we can make development more inclusive and how we can bridge all these gaps in inequalities. So if you look carefully at the paper, the real argument here is that, yes, government is a primary actor in dealing with this, but philanthropy has a space within what you call the development architecture of a country. And what philanthropy should do, in my view, is to make sure that it is investing resources in ways and in areas that will help to bridge the gap in inequality and make development more inclusive. So it's against that backdrop that we try to make an argument to say, why are we talking about inequality? It has been around for a long time. And in the paper, we specifically looked at the most recent report at the time, which was the Human Development Report of 2019, in which the UNDP laid emphasis on the fact that inequality was rising. And if you look at Nigeria, where at the same time, the report out there were that Nigeria has now overtaken China, India, in terms of the number of people who are living in absolute poverty or below the poverty line. There clearly was a need to reflect around inequality and what philanthropy can do to bridge that gap. So our argument is that to tackle this, it has to be a deliberate effort. And to make maximum use of the resources at hand, we need to look at those spaces whereby if we invest our resources, we will be reaching the most people in need. And in our case in Nigeria, it's really in health and education. And the reasons are obvious. The paper makes a case. The argument here is that we have neglected tropical diseases across the country. And out of the 17 that has been highlighted by WHO as affecting people across the world, we have 13 here in Nigeria. And the impact of that has been that a whole lot of people cannot live a normal life. They cannot be productive at full capacity. And so if we want to make really a dent in bridging the gaps in inequality, we need to focus on investment in that. The next sector we looked at was education. Here we have a country where they say 40%, up to 40% of children aged 6 to 11 are out of school. And in fact, there's even an argument that the number could be higher than that. But again, if you have a huge chunk of the future of the country out of school, there clearly is a need for investment in that area. And why are people out of school? It is also a question of inequality, poverty, and there may be other social factors, but by and large, people just can't afford to send their kids to school. So our argument in the paper is that for government to do something significant, government needs to invest in that area. And that is partly why the foundation also had put in part of its investment in the first decade in the area of education and health. Now, this is purely in line with the vision of the founder. At the time the foundation was established, there was a background research to look at the areas in which the foundation should invest its resources. And it became clear that we needed to do investment in education, health, and if you like, poverty alleviation or income generation. And what we quickly noticed was that income generation or poverty alleviation is endless. It would be difficult to put resources there in a way that will meaningfully impact the vast majority of people. we need to go to the crux of the matter, which is health and education. Give people basic health, give people access to basic education. And although we've done this, we realize that the challenge is still huge. The problem is growing. The gap is enormous. And so that is why in reflecting over the 10 years of the work of the foundation, we try to lay emphasis on this issue of inequality, the need for inclusive development, and to point to the direction of what the foundation has done in this area, and then calling upon well-meaning Nigerians and other actors interested in work in Nigeria to invest in education and health, especially as part of effort to bridge the gap in inequality. Yeah, so I think that will be it from my end as an intro. Then I'll be happy to take all the questions that arise from this.
Thank you very much, Gima. Something that I never told you is that my mother lived in Nigeria for a very long time. So it must have been 14 years thereabout in Kano State. So I'm a bit familiar with some of the challenges, and she was there for a polio project. They were working on polio eradication in those regions. So, and it's not even a Nigeria problem. Throughout the continent, we are battling with these various diseases, and inequality continues to rise even today. I think before we let you go, I just wanted to know, now with the COVID going on, inequality was bound to fall apart now. It's going to widen much, much more. So what is the foundation looking at the recent developments to try and bridge the gap, because they're just going to widen now with the COVID that is ravaging the continent?
Okay, thank you. And really interesting to know your mom lived in Kano, because Kano was one of those places where there was a lot of focus in terms of eradication of polio. And as you know, 2 years back, Nigeria now got the certification to say finally there were no polio cases in the country. Now, specifically to your question about COVID-19 and the growing gap in inequality, that is exactly what is happening, because the outbreak of the pandemic meant people had to stay at home. And a lot of the ordinary people who depend on petty trading, petty jobs, and daily wages could no longer make ends meet. And that is why there was an outcry for government to provide some form of palliative food support to make sure that those families are able to sustain themselves during the period of the lockdown. And the foundation worked at the largest internally displaced persons camp right here in the capital, in the FCT. There's a camp with over 1,000 households. We try to provide food and other non-food items to all the residents of the camp. We also try to look at the schools now that they're planning to reopen schools. So we work with 17 schools to provide them with water point. So basically to give them boreholes with overhead tank and wash hand points, so that as the people go back to school, they're able to maintain some basic hygiene and sanitation as part of measures to curb the spread of the pandemic. But the chairman and the founder as a person had invested, because what the government did was to call some investors, capitalists, and Nigerians interested in fighting the pandemic, who were business people doing well, to rally around the government and provide some form of support. So the founder supported some of the isolation centers and provided food support also across the country. We are hopeful that now that the government is easing the lockdown, the gap that people have been crying about that will grow, the gap of inequality, will reduce a little bit, because people will be able to go back to work, make ends meet, go back to their daily wages. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Gima. So Gima is still around, everyone. If you require any clarification, and Gima, you're focusing on Nigeria, is it? It's only Nigeria where your activities are?
Yes, we are focused on Nigeria. But like you said, we are focused on Nigeria. We talk with friends all over the place. What happened in Nigeria is really a reflection of what is happening in a lot of parts across West Africa, and surely in other parts of the continent.
In every way, I can safely say that from the data that we've gathered thus far. So if you have questions or comments for Gima, even just to understand what the work of the TY Danjuma Foundation does, this is your opportunity to do so. I've had a lot of conversations with people, and I've also overheard people speaking about how difficult it is to get African philanthropists involved in our various initiatives. So maybe to clear that smoke for you, Gima is here. You can find out how to penetrate and what focus areas to look at to get more involvement from the likes of your TY Danjuma Foundation. So put your questions and comments up on the chat function at any point in time today. Thank you so much for that, Gima. Okay, so I'm gonna introduce our next speaker. The second speaker is Tendai Murisa from the Civio Institute in Harare. The paper that he published is titled Exploring the Means of Philanthropy in Rural Context, and he's looking at the case of Zimbabwe. So Dr. Murisa, and I'm saying it slowly and carefully, karibu sana, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Kara. At least you didn't say Musira, so it's fine. But thanks for having me. And also, Gima, thank you so much for your presentation on the TY Danjuma Foundation. A very important sort of and noble cause that you are sort of addressing in Nigeria. We've had the privilege of following on your work, and it's important work. And also, I'm grateful to the organizers for the way they organized this particular webinar, in the sense that we're starting off with a discussion of a foundation. Then we're also now looking at how communities actually sort of cohere their own giving. So I'll start off by just talking about the multiple forms of philanthropy across Africa that we see. There is what we call the vertical forms of philanthropy, typically like the one that Gima was making reference to, which is like from one individual or one family to many. We see that growing across the continent with the improvement of socioeconomic conditions and the growth of high net worth individuals across the continent. We're seeing that growing. But also there is another kind of sort of form of philanthropy that we have on the continent, which is what we may call from many to many, or from many to one. That which we sort of in a very short circuit and call it horizontal philanthropy, because it's peer-to-peer giving. And that's sort of the area that I am looking at when I'm looking at Zimbabwe. Yes, Zimbabwe is a case study, but this does not mean that the phenomena I'm discussing is limited to Zimbabwe. We see it coming across, cutting across African contexts, and it's got many names that it's given. In East Africa, you find names like Harambe, Ujamaa. Here in Southern Africa, we have terms like Vukuzenzele, Amanusa, all of them falling under, and Susu, etc., all of them falling under the rubric of what we may call Ubuntu. Our philanthropy being defined by that concept of Ubuntu, that your identity is always linked to others. You don't live in isolation. I am because you are. So that's sort of the kind of solidarity and philanthropy that we see that is quite common in rural context, but also we see more of it now, even in urban context. So the question that I start off by asking is a question that was posed by Tade Aina in his 2013 chapter in a book that was co-edited by Tade and also Begi Moyo. So is it possible that philanthropy in Africa can be viewed, number one, as a process, a way of life in which citizens take responsibility for as much as possible of what happens around them? So when we look at it from that perspective, that philanthropy is a joint effort of citizens, no matter their economic station, but that there's some form of philanthropic activity happening around it. So what is the purpose of some of this giving that we're calling horizontal philanthropy? Is number one, giving to help others. Number two, giving to resist. Most of the liberation struggles that were fought on the continent benefited a lot from this kind of solidarity emerging from communities. Then also giving to collaborate politically. some of the things that we're beginning to see right now, communities organizing themselves to resist some of the innovations or interventions of the state. Then also there's what we call the giving for development, which is what I'm sort of discussing today, the giving for development from many to many. My case study focuses on this sort of work that communities are doing, and it's basically on Zimbabwe, like I've said. But as a way of background, most of you, when you hear Zimbabwe, I think it conjures negative press statements around narratives of collapse, corruption, abuse of office, and a crisis that has a longer history than widely acknowledged from the late 1990s up to now. And also, alongside that crisis is also the limited flows of official development aid and also just generally support from NGOs, etc. So the question that you asked, that in an environment like Zimbabwe, a context of crisis, state collapse, the state is very weak in terms of cohering, even social service delivery, etc. How are people dying? How are people surviving? Why is it that we're not hearing that people are dying on the streets, that people are hungry, etc., etc.? What explains that? Partly, I'm not saying this is a silver bullet, but partly we could look at what communities are doing, and it gives us sort of pointers of where things are and how things are moving. So the research approach is multidisciplinary in nature. There's a lot of ethnographic study. It's based on case studies, 8 case studies that I carried out in Goromonzi, also in Zimba, Goromonzi being to the east of Harare, Zimba to the west of Harare, and also mostly on newly resettled areas. Zimbabwe went through a major land reform program in 2000 to 2003. So my intention was to understand how communities, the ways in which communities are emerging and what kind of instruments are they using or formations are emerging. But so it helps us to understand how communities engage in, number one, horizontal philanthropy. And these thick case studies sort of provide sort of detailed and nuanced understanding of what is going on. So like I said, I borrow a lot from ethnography. I also borrow a lot from political science when I look at the internal processes of how leadership emerges, how structures of governance are established, etc. Just trying to understand, in as much as we would want to understand, say, the TY Danjuma Foundation, but here trying to understand the formations being established by communities. So, and also on it is also building upon a tradition started way back by others, where they talk about the kind of forms or African forms of social organization. Are they peculiar? Are they different to what we know? Do they inhibit or promote philanthropic sort of activities? So when we understand that, we begin to realize that if you look at the manner in which societies are organized, they are mostly organized around 3 things: production, welfare, and also the manner in which land is allocated. All those, if you look at them, they point towards a more communitarian approach rather than an individualistic approach. Our land tenure systems are mostly customary. So there's a juxtaposition of individual land holding and common associational types or common grazing lands, meaning that there is always an imperative for communities or members of communities to interact at the level of use of land. That's number one. And our production is most of the times also, even though it's on individual farms, but it's also most of the times when we are farming on our land, we're using what you'd call maybe isiZulu, amanxusa, in Shona, Nimbe, these labor and asset pooling formations that create synergies around other households who may be deficit in certain assets, coming together and pulling together and managing to organize their production. So that's number 2. Then number 3 is the organization for welfare. You may have heard these terms in isiZulu, Isphala Senkosi, Zundera Mambo in Shona here. All these are talking about communal granaries, so that our communities traditionally have a way of dealing with famines and disasters based on community organizing before we even go to the state level. So all these things influence our understanding of social organization, yeah? And also we begin to say, if we're really talking about philanthropy, the love of humanity or the love for humanity, and others have said philanthropy only manifests in the gift of money, but we're saying that the love for humanity is broader than money. It is about how we share time together, how we share how we provide empathy and support to each other, how we provide security to each other, how we share the food that we have. So if we look at philanthropy from that broad perspective, we begin to realize that communities, rural and otherwise, are engaged in various forms of philanthropic activity on a day-to-day basis. So I have to be cautious about this. We are not saying community philanthropy or horizontal philanthropy is a silver bullet that will resolve problems that we face. No, we're saying that it is possibly an entry point when we're discussing African development, given our frustration with the kind of development trajectories that we see sort of being imposed upon communities, either by governments or by international NGOs, etc. But we could learn from what communities are already doing. But in itself, community philanthropy can also be captured by sort of negative cultural practices such as patriarchy, which subjugates women in certain ways, even the labor allocation roles. And also in terms of famines and disasters, it may be limited to just think of that communities will resolve their problems, because famines and disasters tend to affect communities to an extent that their assets are depleted and they have no capacity to then resolve. Then number three, it does not necessarily increase in aggregate manner the assets within a community. So if we're going to a community that has been sort of, has gone through war, has gone through disease, there may be need for external intervention. But the argument we're making is that it's a good entry point into a community, just to understand what communities are doing. So back to Zimbabwe, as I try to conclude, like any other African countries, Zimbabwe is a country of associations, yeah? 44% of all the households in Zimbabwe belong to an association of sorts. This is either rural or urban. And associations, yeah, I'm using it loosely to talk about the voluntary places where we go to. It could be a church, it could be a mosque, it could be a burial society, etc. You find that one family may belong to 2 or 3 of these. And these help in terms of cohering welfare, cohering solidarity, cohering even our production. So when we're going, then now we look at how communities do emerge. Fast Track Land Reform Program, starting in 2000, provides an entry point, because this is a resettlement of 160,000 households who are complete strangers from one another, being brought into a place and they have to coexist. So from a sociological perspective, you are interested in understanding how communities emerge. One of the things that we saw, Ian Schoons wrote about this, Sam Moyo wrote about this, I wrote about this, Malin Decker and Ba also wrote about this, to say one of the first things that communities do when they sort of come together, these resettled communities, is to establish these local groups for community solidarity. So they're established either for asset pooling, they're established either for mobilization of savings, or even for labor pooling. So my study looked at 8 groups, 6 in Goromonzi, which is to the east of Harare, and 2 in Zimba. And I was interested in understanding their background, the rationale for formation. Why did these groups emerge the way they did? So we're looking at their shift from being unstructured to being structured. Some of them were so complicated, they had constitutions, they had dates for their meetings, they had minutes of their meetings, etc. So trying to understand how they emerged, and also realizing the role of external development agents such as extension officers, and also, you know, the rural life is always differentiated, the role of the more educated farmers like teachers, etc., and also experiences of those who had been resettled, taking the experiences from their former rural homes into these new areas. But what we saw is cutting across the newly resettled areas is the emergence of these. And what are they trying to achieve? Number one, to jointly source for inputs, pooling labor, pooling assets, and mobilizing savings. And also what we learned as we're looking at these groups is there are varying levels of cooperation. So they're actually very complicated entities. So you've got low cooperators who just cooperate for a certain season, for a certain period around certain activities. Then you have medium cooperators, then you have high cooperators. The high cooperators beginning to mimic what we see also in the global West around sort of community foundations, where they're pulling together assets, organizing welfare, organizing the welfare of children, looking after each other, etc. And so the question that we ask for some of us who are sort of engaged in questions around development, as I conclude, is these communities are actively engaged in responding to these immediate challenges they face. But do these formations suggest to us the need to rethink mainstream development models? Do they also suggest the need to rethink how the philanthropy that Gima is talking about, to how it connects with communities, who sets the agenda, etc. So we begin to realize that number one, and this is a takeaway, communities are actively engaged in trying to cohere a better life for themselves and using philanthropic tools, using solidarity, etc. But the challenge we have is the extent to which collaborations and partnerships are established with external agents of development. I'll end here for now, Kera, and we can continue the discussion.
Thank you very much, Tendai. I was nodding vigorously as you were talking. And before we let you go, I'd really like you to elaborate a little bit and maybe give us some examples of those coping mechanisms and the instruments that the communities are using for self-help, if you call it. I remember when COVID started in March 2020, there were some forecasts that were issued out how this is going to wipe Africa clean and we're going to die in abundance. I'm sure you read all of those. But we are coping. Honestly, I'm quite proud of where Africa is. Yes, of course, the pandemic is causing a lot of challenges for us, but those forecasts that they made at the beginning of March are not manifesting on our continent. And thank God they're not, right? So it could be these community coping mechanisms that you're describing, that we're not as helpless as you think. We find ways to survive. We find ways to cope, especially a case like Zim, where the government does not have capacity to be able to help the ordinary people in the rural areas. So can you describe, Tendai, if you can, just a few of those coping mechanisms, what you have observed with the communities, even now with COVID, how are they coping and helping each other?
Thanks, Kara, for that. Look, this is a very important topic. So for the communities that I study in the paper that was published are communities that even before COVID were already neglected, because fast-track land reform by its very nature is politically contested. The international community is refusing to invest there because of the manner in which land was transferred. And the government, like Kera is saying, that already the government is sort of stretched in terms of capacities. So in such a context, what we actually see and what we celebrate is actually community agency, where communities are coming together, pulling together the limited assets they have, but to cohere and actually improve on their production capacities. So we've seen that happening, and we've also seen them establish community centers from establishment of, just bare bones of a clinic, a bare bones of a school, and having volunteers to come and teach at that school, etc. But with the onset of COVID, what we also saw beyond even these communities is the establishment even of feeding kitchens, etc., looking after the vulnerable, etc. But even when what we see in the urban areas, I always say that its DNA originates from the rural areas, because it is in the rural areas where we have learned this solidarity, that I am because you are, that my neighbor is part of me, etc. So we've carried out another study building upon this one, where we've actually seen the mushrooming of initiatives led by very ordinary citizens, some of them just being traders, but who come together after realizing a need and establishing these things. I suppose those who sort of forecast the demise of Africa, or the collapse of Africa due to the COVID pandemic, have not, number one, learned how we had responded to HIV/AIDS, and also have not learned how we respond to droughts that come after every 4 to 5 years, and also now this. So I think building upon that organic memory, Africans cohere and they keep on forging strategies around sort of sustainability, even in the absence of government, but on their own. So agency is something that we underplay, but it's something that is major in how Africa is organized.
Thank you, Tendai. When those forecasts came out, I did what they would do in Nigeria and say, God forbid, we're not going to be wiped out like that. God forbid. And thank God, hopefully COVID will get behind us, but we have faced other disasters as a continent. Most countries were in the middle of a drought when COVID started. We've had famines, cyclones, flooding, you name it, and we are still here. So there are some self-help coping mechanisms that we need to acknowledge on our continent. Thank you also for educating us on the local languages and the names for some of these customs that are going on the continent. The fact that it has a name, it shows that it has some history with our people, because when you can't find a local name for it, it means it's not indigenous. I was trying to explain what ice cream is to my daughter the other day, and I realized it doesn't have an indigenous name because it's not local. It's not something that came from here. So thank you for elaborating on that. Both the speakers are done. So we are going to move on to the Q&A session. The way that we need to handle this is in a very open way. So you can send questions, comments on the chat. If you are feeling confident enough, you can raise your hand and speak. However, if you do speak, please just keep it brief and go straight to the question so that we can be able to attend to everyone. Okay, so post your questions and your chats. So the first question that I have is for Gima. If we just go back to Gima, you mentioned water services, that the Danjuma Foundation focuses on education and health, right? But you did mention that you moved into water also to make sure that people have access to sanitation and to be able to wash their hands as the COVID regulations recommend. Is the TY Danjuma Foundation open to changing the scope to more than health and education? Because a lot of things are developing by the day, actually, with this COVID throughout the continent. Is the Danjuma Foundation open to looking beyond health and education? Because the inequality that you describe is going to continue to rise.
Thank you so much for the question. And also, thank you so much for the presentation, Tendai. It was quite breathtaking listening to you. Yeah, so health and education are the current focus of the foundation. Tendai knows the foundation from inception. When we started, we had 5 focus areas. So we had health, we had education, we had another segment called peace education, we had policy advocacy, then we had income generation. And then over the years, the founder has been pushing us closer to what his original vision is, which is really to work on preventable blindness. And so now we have health and education, but even under our health portfolio, the first thing is preventable blindness. Then we have this broad umbrella of neglected tropical diseases, then maternal and child health. Education, in the past, we did a whole lot of things, but right now we are focused on improving the quality of teaching. Because what we learned after 7 years was that brick and mortar really does not necessarily reflect into improved educational outcome. So we need to work on the teachers and improve the quality of teaching. Now, having said that, the strategic plan will be reviewed, I think, in a year's time. And there's a possibility that, the board may say, hey, let's open up and do more things, or maybe let's narrow some more and focus on health and education and deep, because the question has always been, do we spread thin or do we dig very deep on the same spot? And that has been where we have a challenge. But I think with regards to water, sanitation, and hygiene, we came to the conclusion that these were cross-cutting themes that you can't separate from any intervention, whether it is health or education. So for example, the water we are doing them in schools. And ordinarily, this would be what we do under a water project when we had a mini program running just for water, sanitation, and hygiene. But now, if we renovate a health facility, the first thing we want to ensure is that they have water also on their compound so that, it can run effectively. If we construct a school, renovate a school, we want to make sure that they also have water. So the whole discussion around water, sanitation, and hygiene is a cross-cutting thing that underpins our work in health and education. But surely the expansion is something which the board will consider as they review the strategic plan in the years ahead.
And also into other countries, right?
That is something which we have been pushing for, because you will always have people like Becky, and I'm sure Tendai, they would like to see us come to Zimbabwe. Hopefully one day we'll get there.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. The next question is for you, Tendai. It's coming from Nachula Wilson at Ashesi University in Ghana. She wants to know if you have found funding from more wealthy and influential individuals going specifically towards their own communities, so the Danjumas of this world and their communities, versus reaching a wider set of communities that are in need. So have you found that the wealthy, influential people are going for back home at their village beyond the wider communities that are in need?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. I think, as the adage says, charity begins at home. Many of the high net worth individuals and their foundations, when they start in their inception, they normally start with their villages. They normally go back to their villages. But I think over the years, because of their growth in terms of prominence and the kind of gifts they are giving, they are now under unbearable pressure to spread their wings. Like you keep on saying, Kera, to say, move beyond Nigeria, etc. But they've already started the process. So if you look, for instance, from the time of the Ebola response, the push for support to the AU, when Paul Kagame goes there as the chair and realizes that the AU is mostly funded by foreign institutions, he mobilizes high net worth individuals and says, let's create a fundraising committee from fellow Africans. Then COVID-19, the same thing. So there's pressure on what I would call maybe the ultra high net worth individuals that are visible, that we know about, that Forbes tracks. But there's another layer that we always miss in our discussions. And this is what maybe you'll call the middle class. And this layer is in Africa, and also it's in the diaspora. And this is where the growth is actually happening. There's a huge growth of the African middle class. And this is where we're beginning to see associations that relate to communities. So you may find a KwaZulu-Natal Development Association driven by yappies, maybe in Joburg or at this Joburg Stock Exchange, whatever. You find this when you go into New York, you find an association of Ghanaians that are also organizing, giving back to their country, etc. So this is where, because it's missing in the literature, we're not capturing, but it's there. So when you begin to maybe to go back and begin to research rural communities, you may actually find that they have a better relationship with these kinds of middle-class-led diaspora or local associations that are doing urban to rural development, bigger than maybe what the role of INGOs are or the bigger foundations. But it's just that the center, and I'm putting this on Kera, the center needs, we need, as the center, there's need for that kind of research, because we need to surface these new forms of giving. They are there, they're always engaged in some form of giving. There's a funeral, there's a bridge that has been swept away by water. Before you know it, there's money that has come. There's a group of young men, group of young ladies who are in Joburg who send this money to do this. But it's just that we don't write and we don't document this, but it's ongoing.
Thank you, Tendai, which is why this journal is so important. There's now a platform to be able to do more of this kind of research and provide very particular context. You can look at one community, one country on our continent, and we have some data and facts pertaining to how people give. So giving is very much natural for us. I think the reason why you may find the wealthy individuals not expanding as yet, I would imagine as an African, you want to make sure your grandmother and your people are okay first before you go and feed another grandmother. Of course, they will get there, but charity begins at home, as you're saying, to try and let things be a bit better and stable where you're coming from, because all areas of the continent definitely need some assistance. Okay, so Gima, okay, this is not a question. It's a comment from Aminu Kazaure, who's here on the call. She says she adores what you do. She is from the Dangote Foundation. So welcome to you as well, Aminu. And then her question, so she does have a question. To Gima, are there some issues to tackle in education in Nigeria? and the issues spread across different stages of schooling, so from primary school to high school, where will you say the focus should be? Is there a ranking for problems in the education sector? Do you want to focus on the children or those ones who are in high school, or even those that are in tertiary? Where should the focus be? And how do you think that collaboration will help? Gima?
Okay, thank you so much, Aminu, for the question. He's right. The problem in the education sector is really enormous. And when we started, we wanted to construct, we wanted to train the teachers, we wanted to provide books, we wanted to give scholarships, we wanted to advocate for greater government funding, just everywhere, so much. But you realize that with a lot of the schools, what people were interested in lots of the places where we work where people know, one, they wanted to have structures where people can go attend classes. Then number two, get the teachers to come teach the children. So those were, in terms of priority, where we work, the baseline indicated that people wanted schools and they wanted teachers in those schools. We did that for a couple of years. Then suddenly we realized that after I think about 2-3 years, we realized that yes, you have schools, you have teachers, the people are not going to school. And what was the problem? Oh, in some communities, the kids are engaged by parents to be doing other chores during cooking, during schooling hours. People need to eat. Maybe if you provide food, they will go to school. So we experimented with 2 schools. We are feeding in 2 schools. We started this long ago, and it drove up attendance. Then the next thing, people are coming to school, they are eating, yes, but the results are not very encouraging. So then we had to focus again, refocus, now improve the quality of teaching. So in terms of ranking, if we reflect and go back to where we started, I would say we should focus first of all on improving learning outcomes. And the way to do that is to have better teachers. It is safer to have a qualified teacher teaching under a tree and the people being impacted upon getting the right knowledge than to have a beautiful building and people really are not learning. So I will start from there, and then I go downward towards now having bricks and mortar and providing the other things for the classroom. But really we'll focus on the teachers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gima. So if there are some brave ones who want to verbally say their comment or question, you can raise your hand. I think the function is active. Godfrey, if you can just activate for them. If not, you can still go ahead and post your questions and comments on the chat. So we have another one. It's to both of you, both Tendai and to Gima. Thank you to both of you for your presentations. They're very insightful. And the question is, what are some of the things that need to be considered within African philanthropy as it grows and expands, so that we don't mimic Western philanthropy? Definitely not, God forbid. Secondly, okay, no, let's answer that one first. What are some of the things that can be considered within African philanthropy as it grows and expands, so that we do not find ourselves mimicking Western philanthropy? Any of you can take it first. Yes, yes, Gima. Is your hand up?
Now, I was going to say, Tendai has done a lot of work in this area, but I would just say, coming from an organization that we used to get funding from organizations from the West before getting Trust Africa to come on board to support us, there's quite a whole lot that we can do as African institution that would really grow the social space in a sustainable way. And for me, the most critical one, which is what I saw the institution struggling with that time as a staff, is, for the funding, funders tend to want to see results, and so they pump in a lot of resources into the programs. And it is the programs. There is the administrative part that has to deal with the people running the organization, dealing with salaries, rent, and stuff like that. I think that for the philanthropic organizations that are grant makers in particular, there is need to carefully think about institutional support for those good organizations doing the work that we fund, rather than just laying emphasis on the programs, then organizations are pushed in a tight corner and have to be inventive. So I think it is very important to expand the margin for institutional support.
Okay. Tendai, you want to add?
Yes, just a small one. So there is, I started off, maybe I didn't make it strongly. There's a huge distinction that we have to make between philanthropy in Africa, which is what everyone brings to Africa. We can measure that, we can understand that. Then there's, and also African philanthropy, what the Africans do. We hope there should be, we hope and pray that there will be a distinction between what African philanthropy looks like compared to the generic philanthropy in Africa. The challenges in the philanthropy value chain, if you'd like, is the hierarchies that we have, the power embedded at every level, the donor, the intermediary that maybe is now doing sub-granting, and the grantee organization and the communities. At each level, there is a power dynamic. And at each level, there is an assumption of having superior knowledge than the next person. This has been, and it's a criticism that we've been making. And that's why for some of us who've been talking about African philanthropy for close to a decade, is that we hope that African philanthropy will not mimic those bad practices. And African philanthropy will be, by its very nature, collaborative, by its very nature, consultative, by its very nature, will also be engaging in conversations such as this one, in conversations with NGOs, with communities, because half the time we have created silos in a process where there's supposed to be an open discussion. So a philanthropy foundation comes up with this strategy to say, this year we are going to focus on water delivery, on HIV/AIDS, based on maybe a consultant's review, and they go to Community X and say, this is what we are doing. But rarely have you consulted, or have you consulted or checked if that's what the community needs. So we've had all these failed development experiments because we have not given communities voice. So for some of us who are observing African philanthropy, especially the one done by high net worth individuals that are establishing foundations and moving a significant amount of money, is our hope that they will not mimic Western practices, but they will actually turn logic on its head and begin to work differently. And where we've been successful is when we have these conversations and we begin to say, philanthropy needs to have an ear to the ground. Philanthropy needs to be part of what the communities are saying. So there's a lot that needs to change if we're really serious about the development agenda.
Absolutely. Thank you both for your responses. So I just omitted to mention who asked that question. It was Eda Joa. And she also asked a second question saying, aside from possibly the lack of collaborations with external agents of development, what are some of the other reasons why there has been limited acknowledgement and appreciation for the solidarity and giving that is done in Africa at the community level? So according to your knowledge, what are some of the other reasons why there's limited acknowledgement and appreciation for African solidarity and giving at the community level? I think this one is for you, Tendai.
I think, Kira, it speaks to the issue you have raised, that the journal has come so that we can begin to tell our story. Because half the time, the philanthropy story in Africa has been written elsewhere. Some of us were spending time writing for Alliance Magazine, being in international platforms, because there was no place, there was no platform on the continent where we could have this exchange. So I think that, and also we just do not document these things properly. So like we keep on saying, maybe the intervention of the journal will improve the narrative around African philanthropy. I don't think there's anything sinister about it. It's just that it's not being captured well. Even when we have researchers, colleagues coming from the West, at times they do not have the right tools to track and understand this. Because some of this philanthropy is seasonal. You may go into a community and you will not see it, but it's embedded within how they work. Somebody may come and say, I'm looking for a foundation. So they are looking for a physical building called a foundation. But the communities can meet under a tree, they can meet at a funeral, they can meet and discuss, and also organize welfare within those informal settings. But if you're coming with a certain sort of epistemology of how you study things, you may actually miss those things.
Yeah, absolutely. I strongly agree with that. I mean, history is obviously kind to the person who's writing it, right? You'll only reflect what it is that you know and what it is that you see. So if you attend an African funeral now and you're going to write about it, so you come from USA or whatever, and you document what you see, you're obviously going to speak about what happened on the day. You're going to miss the contributions that came 2 weeks ago from the neighbor who brought their goat, another neighbor who bought meal. You're going to miss all the comfort and solidarity that happened days before the funeral because you're only reporting what it is that you see. So the challenge is to all of you on this call, all of the people that are following the journal, let's tell our own stories, let's document and find data and facts to how communities give and how communities are self-coping and doing this horizontal philanthropy that Tendai is describing. The challenge is on us. We have nobody to blame for it, but look at it as an opportunity to document our stories and how we do things around here. Okay, so we have a couple more questions. This one is from Eme. Eme is from Philanthropy Circuit. She says, thank you to both of you, Tendai and to Gima. And she's asking, can we speak about the importance of collaborations, especially if it affects smaller community organizations, which was linked to the question above. But I just want to bring in David's question as well. So you respond to both when you respond. This one goes to you, Tendai. I agree with you that communities in Zimbabwe find ways to survive even without external support. This is coming from David Gwasira. Communities are very resilient. Did your study cover the influence of community leadership in the success of horizontal philanthropy? What are the consequences if one decides not to participate? And this is from David Gwasira. He's from REPSI, which you probably know very well in Zimbabwe. So please answer both Eme and David's questions.
So the collaboration part is very important because at times the logic of organization is such that we rarely use these terms in development, but there's competition for turf. So you may find INGOs or NGOs, let's just use the term NGOs. When they enter communities, they create organizations, beneficiaries of their projects. So those organizations, there may be 2 or 3 with different leaders in one community, and they may not see, or they may not even have the chance to see themselves as there's the need for them to collaborate beyond the funded projects or the NGO interventions in their communities. So it becomes a challenge. But when you look at organic sort of things that we are seeing led by community leaders, you always find in different ways, because there are different ways of creating boundaries in a community. At times it's a physical boundary that you call a river. At times it's a language boundary. At times it's a totem boundary. But when disaster strikes, there may be a time whereby the community from across the river has to depend on the other community. So collaboration, without it being used in a technical sense, is already an ongoing process. But it's for us as external agents of development to come and tap into what exists rather than trying to create something from ground up. That's number one. Then number 2, the issue of leaders and their role. Leaders, from my study, I actually saw that there is leaders emerge at times organically, but also leaders can emerge based on a certain claim they make maybe on traditional authority. And both of them, they can be promoters, or actually they can actually disenable community agency, depending mostly around the character of the leader, etc., that maybe he finds something that is existing and is not at the center of it, and he works hard towards sort of destabilizing it. But in many instances, the communities that I saw and found resilient, he had leaders that were engaged, and these were leaders who either they're traditional leaders or somebody who's just respected in a community, either as a pastor or a teacher who's seen as more educated than others, brings a certain kind of knowledge to the community. Actually find that when you have somebody who's also involved in that kind at that level, these organizations actually tend to be stronger. Yeah. Then there's also the challenge around saying what happens if somebody does not want to join. That's where the benefit of anthropology and ethnographic studies come in, because issues to do with identity, they can be enablers, but also disenablers. And also they can give certain tags to say certain people do not participate because maybe they're engaged in witchcraft or because of this, etc. So there is a price to pay when you choose not to be part of a community. And communities, remember, if you're in a community, you want people to come to your funeral. So half the time, the things that happen in a community, embedded in them is a certain level of what I'll call maybe cohesion, implicit cohesion. Because if you do not participate today, they will mark to say, so-and-so does not come to other people's funerals or to other people's nusa when they are doing in the field and they are working together to help somebody weed, and you miss out. So they will note that, and they'll make sure that there's a punishment for it when you don't do it. So half the time, what we call voluntary is something that needs further understanding to say, to what extent are these formations in actual fact voluntary, or it's because of the embedded punishments within a community, which also blows up the issue around, like I said, community philanthropy in itself is not a silver bullet. There's a lot of things that we have not yet studied that we need to explore before we start celebrating it. Because it could be inimical to development. It could have its own challenges. That's why I'm saying that we need to be getting these studies on and on, moving on, having these case studies, deep case studies, thick descriptions, where we observe all these things before we say, oh, we found a solution, eureka, this works. It may not work. But from what we're seeing right now, it's what is influencing solidarity and cohering sort of in the face of crisis. These are these sort of platforms that are helping to strengthen livelihoods.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more, Tendai. In fact, the influence of religious leaders, you can write a whole book about that throughout the continent. They have influence everywhere, some good, some bad as well. So there's a whole avenue that we can explore them. We have a question from Odax Rukonge in Tanzania, and I hope it's a she, is asking whether we think African societies need to increase their level of transparency in order to increase enthusiasm on philanthropic practices. So should we perhaps look at ourselves, openness and transparency to be able to put more light on our philanthropic activities? And then do you think the way African government conducts their businesses can have an impact on the readiness for communities to mobilize resources for a common cause? Oh, it's a man. I'm sorry, Odax. I always default to she. Sorry for that. So Odax Rugonge from Tanzania, please can you respond to his two questions? I think Tendai probably the last part on, the openness, transparency in order to increase enthusiasm on philanthropic practices. And then Gima, because you may have some experience working with African governments, do you think the way African governments conduct their businesses can have an impact on the readiness for communities to mobilize resources? So let's start with you, Tendai.
So let's start with the openness part, which I had sort of openness, transparency in order to increase enthusiasm. I think that's one of the things to say, what is the incentive for giving? Because if you look at the UK, the US, if you in a church and you make an offering, in the UK is tax deductible because you're giving to a charity. But here we don't have those incentives for giving. We're not talking about big gifts, but just giving at a small level to begin to say, if a certain portion of my income was going to Goromonzi Rural Women's Association, and if that association had a tax deductible status, that means that I'll get the benefit and I'll give. We've seen these incentives as key drivers in how philanthropy has grown in the developed North. But here people give regardless, the fact that there are no incentives, they keep on giving. But that could help. It could be an incentive that is necessary. And number two, also the openness around giving, the kind of gifts that are given. If we had sort of, as the center or as other centers across the continent, if we just ran a campaign and ran something that is public out there to say communities and people in community X are giving this, are giving this, it may create an enthusiasm because we've not really highlighted this as a good sort of form of behavior. So we're not reinforcing good behavior. We're just saying, it exists, it's there, etc. But we rarely celebrate it. We know what happens to human behavior when you celebrate it. So if we're to sort of create, if you look at the Chronicle of Philanthropy in the US, etc., when they're always saying who gave the most, which community gives the most, etc., it creates, without you saying it, it creates the desire to give some more. But we don't see that happening quite a lot on the continent. It's like we've made it like, we always say that Africans give, but they don't want to be acknowledged, they whatever, because of their religious things. I understand that, but I also think that the others would not give necessarily out of religion, but they would do with acknowledgement. So that's just my take on it.
Yeah, and to express the gratitude as well. It's encouraging to the person who's giving to show that what you're doing is being appreciated. And you're absolutely right. It drives you to want to do some more. So perhaps we should express that gratitude more openly so that we can get more of those things that they're giving us. Gima, just the second part of the question from Odax. African governments now, do you think the way in which they conduct their business can have an impact on the readiness for communities to mobilize resources for a common cause? You can obviously give your country context, whatever you're comfortable with.
Okay, thank you. And I like the fact that in his question, he also qualifies including public resource allocation and spending, because that's really critical in driving how communities may respond and want to come together to mobilize resources. So I give a simple example. The government organizes the budget allocation and prioritizes the needs across the country. And in a lot of places, government will prioritize needs based on their program, the agenda set forth by the government at the start of their mandate. A lot of times, these will not reflect the needs of people at the grassroots. And what does that mean? That means that communities are left to deal with things which government is not going to respond to. And in a lot of places, we've seen churches, social groups coming together to pool resources to put up, say, a health facility, pulling resources together to put up a school, and even to maintain roads and stuff like that. Because if you have a key road that takes resources from the farm to the market, and there are potholes all over the road, so the bridge is bad, and government is not forthcoming with resources to repair those roads, the community will have to do something, improvise in the meantime. So I think the way government allocate resources on time also, will push people towards mobilizing as community and making sure that, they work towards a common cause. And we've seen that over and over.
Thank you for that, Gima. We have a brave one. So Aminu has her hand up. Aminu, female, male, I hope I'm right. So Aminu, the floor is yours. Karibu sana.
Hello, everybody.
Oh, it's
you
a
can
man.
Hear me clearly. It is a man, yes. You got that one wrong. So yeah, I just got a comment, right? And I haven't organized my thoughts, probably in a structured way. But I just wanted to talk about collaboration mostly, right? I work for the Aliko Danjuma Foundation, and recently we were almost like the main coordinators for a project that happened, I think, Gima spoke about it a little bit towards the COVID-19. What we did is that we got the private sector, right, to come together and put in funds so that we can attack we can support the government in terms of the fight against COVID. So the organization was called Coalition Against COVID-19. There were a lot of private sector people that donated a lot of money. The banks as well did that. And my comment also talks to the transparency. I think one of the participants, asked. So in terms of transparency, when we formed that coalition and kind of told the world this is what we are doing, there were a lot of contributions from individuals, from other cooperatives, from other private sectors, because they kind of just trust that as a private organization, we will be able to deliver on our promise. And if you were in Nigeria during the lockdown or just after the lockdown, you would see a lot of food palliatives everywhere with the brand COVID-19 palliatives, which is called CAR-COVID. So in addition to the food relief, we also supported each state, which there are 36 in Nigeria, to set up isolation centers so that they can deal with some of the patients. And the way we did this, that we broadcasted and told the whole nation that we are not giving funds to the government to build this. They tell us exactly what they are lacking. If it's oxygen cylinders, if it's beds, if it's ventilators, we purchase this as a private coalition and actually provide it and deliver it to the state government. So for me, I feel collaboration is absolutely necessary. Our government cannot do everything. If you look at the list of problems in education itself, they are so vast, and there are so many organizations. Since I started in the foundation about 5 to 6 months ago, because I don't actually have an education background. I actually came from the strategy of the group, and then started, they brought me in to handle education, just they wanted a different way of thinking. And my lessons from both what I learned from the Coalition Against COVID-19, where the private parties came together to help, and also what I've been seeing in terms of meeting with people like British Council in Nigeria, USAID, everybody has got an idea of how to solve a particular problem, like say for education. But I feel like there's so many people doing small things in small areas, right? But if you bring everybody together, and that is what I'm trying to focus on, right? List all the problems that we have, right? Then identify who is working in that area and almost form a small collaboration team to impact on that particular problem. Had we not done the Coalition Against COVID-19, right? We heard of a lot of the bank as a community wanted to do something, the oil and gas community wanted to do something. And had we let that happen that way, some states were going to get help and others would not get, right? And as you know, this pandemic, it's not, you cannot contain it in one area because people move from one place to the other, right? So by bringing that coalition, we were able to evenly distribute resources we have across the nation, and it looked absolutely vast, and we actually saw the effect of that. So it is important also to continue to indulge our foreign aids and that, but I find that they're a little bit too expensive, right? Yeah. And they also need the local knowledge as well. We were very instrumental in eradicating polio in Nigeria. We collaborated with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to eradicate because they had the resources, but they didn't have the know-how. And in the northern part of the country, which our chairman Aliko Dangote is from, he played a major part to tell them that, look, it is actually safe to do this vaccination, right? So this is somebody that is local, that understands their problem, that understands their fears, and told them that, look, I know Bill Gates and Melinda Foundation, you know what, they would not introduce anything that will harm you. right? And because of that, a lot more people in the rural areas were open to get the polio vaccination. And that is how we got to eradicate that, right? But I feel every foreign aid kind of needs a local collaborator to actually help deliver some of the objectives that they have. You know, in that way, if you have a local person, you don't bring. Sorry, just 2 seconds, and I'll be done. Yeah. In that way, you know, you don't need to bring in too many consultants, you know, and pay for their flight tickets and things like that. So that was my contribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I actually let you speak because you are saying something very critical, which is areas for collaboration. I take it you and Gima know each other, Danjuma Foundation and Dangote Foundation.
Yes, the foundations know each other, but he and I just exchange emails and phone numbers actually to carry on the conversation.
You actually should, because what you're saying is very important. We're all in this fight for the same thing, right? So if we consolidate those efforts and look at what is the need that's out there in your communities in Nigeria, what is it that Danjuma Foundation can offer? What is it that Dangote Foundation can offer? You can actually get more done. And that's something that we're trying to encourage as the center as well, to really bring some sharing of information and collaborations with our NGO sectors, because at the end of the day, it's the communities who benefit, the same people that we're trying to help throughout the continent. So please, I will actually exchange each other's emails for you on your behalf to make sure that you can connect with each other and consolidate efforts in as far as possible. And it goes beyond Nigeria, throughout the continent. That's how we should look at things. We look at problems in solidarity and solve them in solidarity as well. Okay, so thank you very much for that, Aminu. I don't see any questions, so we can go to the closing parts. I will allow our speakers to give their closing words on their papers. And also a preview. Are you going to submit any more papers for us that we can look forward to? What are you working on right now? Because you are free, it's been published. So you've got time to work on more items. So your last word, 1 minute, please, to each of you, Gima and Tendai. Let's start with you, Gima.
Thank you so much. It's been quite an engaging day. I think your last point really hit it on the head. There is need for increased collaboration. When Aminu spoke, I'm like, who is this other person now from Dangote Foundation? So I quickly sent him a message in the background. He has sent his email. So it is good. You know, these are the opportunities we get on the platform, so that there are issues of common interest for both of us to look at, and it gives an opportunity for us to engage. So this is a good thing, being part of what you people are doing there at VIT. With regards to the writing, which you are pushing us to commit ourselves to, I think we'll keep exploring ways of showcasing the work our partners are doing, and the need to close this gap in inequality. In fact, we're trying to reflect on what can also be done to reduce inequality by private foundation or African philanthropies, in order to make sure that those that are blind, you know, get something, because there's something around preventable blindness. They say more than half of the case of people are blind from causes that are avoidable. What can we do to make sure that this does not happen? So those are some of the things we are thinking about at the moment. But I think overall, it's been a very good engagement and an opportunity to learn, especially about things happening in the southern part with regards to this community spirit of giving, which is happening without lots of people noticing. So Tendai, is really good you are documenting this. Thank you.
Thank you, Gima. Dr. Murisa?
Yes, thank you so much, Gima. Fantastic stuff. So I think if you like to talk of phases, the phase we've been at for a long time now has been to be defensive, you know, to say, no, there's philanthropy happening in Africa. But I think now we need to grow the field, write more critical papers, examine what we're doing, and begin to question the impact of some of these things that we're seeing. Is it really leading us somewhere, etc.? So I think we are getting to a place whereby even our theoretical sort of assumptions need now to be informed by what we are seeing in the field. So there's a lot of, for a researcher, there's a lot more field work to be done for us to understand this, because I think in terms of sort of the caricature of what it looks like, etc., it's been done. But we now need to engage with it, because the question that we ask is philanthropy the silver bullet of whatever form, philanthropy of high net worth individuals, philanthropy by communities, and also to begin to understand what are the challenges, what is it that is limiting the growth of philanthropy from a policy perspective, from a practice perspective, these issues around collaboration. Speak to practice. What sort of practices need to be sort of improved upon, and also to forge conversations between those who are writing about philanthropy and those who are engaged in philanthropy, because both of them need to inform each other. At times we are continuing in silos without informing each other, and meetings like these are very rare, where you get people coming from foundations speaking about their work and even reflecting, writing. It's fantastic that colleagues from our foundations are doing this, and it's important. And also for researchers to begin to engage a bit more forcefully about it, because it's no longer just about does a foundation exist, it's about what is it doing, what are its assumptions, how is it collaborating with communities. So I think there's a lot more work. In terms of some of the studies we're carrying out, we still continue. Some of us are still collaborating with the center. Definitely there's a lot more coming. We just completed a study of 17 community foundations spread across Zimbabwe, published that as a magazine. But now we want to spend more time, not just studying them, but also trying to create some technical capacities so that they can also infuse growth, structure, and processes within them. So I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We wish both of you the very best, and definitely we look forward to more submissions. Aminu, if you can just send me your email, please. Maybe you can submit a paper for the next round and field notes as well. We hear from the Dangote Foundation. But I just want to speak to all of you before we close. Most of you are in different situations. You could be coming from foundations, you could be coming from some civil society group or community-based organization. Wherever you are, whichever country you're at, I think this has clearly demonstrated the appetite that we have for research, data, and facts on our continent. And there is a way in which you can contribute. We are rolling out certificate programs and masterclasses later on this year. So if you feel like you're not really sure what it is that you want to study, you can consider enrolling in some of those certificates and masterclasses just to know the research issues that are out there. And you can embark on your own research as well. You don't need to be some polished up author to write. If there's a community and a burning issue that you can contribute to, we definitely want to hear from you. We also offer master's programs, so you can go ahead and do a master's degree in the field of African philanthropy. But the good thing is that you can look at your context, your country, community issues, even community philanthropy issues, and you use that as your research topic. You will actually find it easier to get through the research component of the program because it's something that's close to you and that you're passionate about. We also offer PhDs. So I'm telling you all of this just to go back home and consider. We also offer PhDs if you already have your master's completed and you are eager to contribute and you don't know how, you can do a research proposal on African philanthropy issues and submit, and you can be part of this entire process. So I really encourage all of us to consider it and to contribute. The journal is here. It's not going away. The next issue will be coming out later this year. So I want to thank both our speakers for those lovely presentations, and to all of you for joining us today. This will not be the end. We are going to have another session later on in February to speak to more authors from this first issue of the journal. And then from there, we will issue out another issue of the journal with new papers and different authors. It's going to be an ongoing process. So thank you so much for your time. I see Peggy's back. Peggy, if you want to say concluding words, and then we can end it off. Yeah.
That's fine. I listened in, and thank you very much, everyone. As Kira has said, we look forward to hosting you more on this webinar series, but on other events that we have planned for the year. So have a great evening, great afternoon, and great morning, depending on where you are.